and Prime Minister Nahas Pasha obtained a treaty with the British, granting Egypt military and judicial sovereignty. At the same time, a new movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, appealed for a revival of Islam. The devout sent a veil to cover the Kaaba in Mecca. Despite her concessions, Britain still held the strategic bases that controlled the Suez Canal, and with it the sea route to India. The British government was becoming increasingly concerned at fascist Italy's colonial ambitions. Italy's conquest of Ethiopia in 1936 deprived the British of an ally. Worse, it threatened Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, the Upper Nile, and the British access to the Red Sea. Mussolini visits Tripoli. The natives danced, but only the colonizers cheered. He also had his eye on Tunisia. Egyptian green shirts give the fascist salute before the pyramids. The Egyptian fascist movement was encouraged by the Italian radio in Bari, transmitting in Arabic. They had little popular support. They were too Western in style, but they were prominent in German propaganda. Dr. Goebbels himself came to Egypt early in 1939. Arab protests went on in Palestine. To defuse the situation on the eve of global conflict, Britain published a white paper stating her intention to reduce Jewish immigration and to create a single state in Palestine for all the different communities. The plan shocked Jews in Britain and Palestine. By early 1939, the French still hadn't ratified the treaties concluded with Syria and Lebanon in 1936. Gabriel Puot was appointed as a new High Commissioner in Beirut. His mission was to prepare the Mandate territories for war, to defend this part of the French Empire, and to protect the oil route. The Syrians were outraged by the French decision to cede the Alexandretta region to Turkey. The transfer proceeded all the same. General Weygand, French commander in the Mediterranean, emphasized the strategic value of the Lebanese ports in the event of war with the Soviet Union. But the real threat came from Germany. In May 1940, Weygand was suddenly recalled to France to turn back the German invasion. He failed to do so, accepted an armistice, and became one of Marshal Pétain's ministers in the Vichy government. Both Syria and Lebanon were now under Vichy rule. The German invasion of Crete in 1941 threatened the whole British position in the eastern Mediterranean. The French territories could now be very useful to Germany. After visiting Hitler at Berchtesgaden, the Vichy Admiral Darlan allowed German aircraft to use the French airbase at Aleppo in Syria to support an anti-British revolt in Iraq. Since Iraq's independence, the British had maintained communications bases there, which were now under attack from pan-Arabists in the Iraqi army. Both the Indian Army and the Arab Legion from Transjordan took part in the defeat of the insurrection. British Imperial communications were safe in Iraq. Syria and Lebanon remained. At dawn on June 8, 1941, General de Gaulle's Free French joined British troops in advance on southern Syria. Facing them was a well-armed French army, commanded by General Dentz, the High Commissioner appointed by Pétain. Admiral Dallon ordered them to resist. The fratricidal fighting was terrible, and Vichy propaganda made full use of it. Suspicious of British intentions, de Gaulle was determined to maintain French influence in Syria and Lebanon. But first, the fighting had to stop. Beirut itself was bombarded. The end was near. General Catroux, the Free French representative in Lebanon and Syria, acted as an intermediary between the Vichy defenders and the British. On July 14th, the British signed a convention allowing the French regiments still loyal to the Vichy government to embark for Marseille, which they did, under the Australians' watchful eyes. By this time, Germany had also invaded the Soviet Union. After fleeing Baghdad, where he'd been in exile since 1939, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem traveled to Berlin to pay his respects to Hitler. Of all the Arab dignitaries forced into exile, few committed such a blunder. Meanwhile, Rommel, the Desert Fox, defeated a British counterattack in Cyrenaica. Regrouping, he sent the Afrika Korps off towards Tobruk and Egypt, dragging the Italians along behind him. Free France fought alongside the British in North Africa too. Here, French troops take Kufra, a Libyan oasis. In August 1942, while the Germans were fighting their way into Egypt and pushing Soviet lines back towards the Caucasus, de Gaulle flew to Syria and Lebanon. Greeted by General Catroux, he reviewed his troops, then paid his respects to the President of Lebanon, Alfred Nakash. Never was a French leader greeted more enthusiastically by the crowds of Beirut and Damascus. People traveled from afar to see him. Both Syria and Lebanon pressed and eventually won their claims for post-war independence from France. But for now, the sense of a moment in history transcended the political wrangling. Appointed the commander of the British 8th Army, General Montgomery halted the Afrika Korps 100 kilometers west of Alexandria. El Alamein, October 23, 1942. This was the turning point. Rommel was defeated. His retreat took him back to Tunisia. Nazi propaganda created arrogant warriors. In defeat, they looked like any other vanquished army. A year earlier in Iran, Reza Shah had appeared very taken with Germany's nationalism, racism, and military might. The Indian army intervened here too, protecting British bases and oil reserves in the Persian Gulf. Silent crowds looked on as they arrived. The German diplomats and councillors fled the country. Reza Shah abdicated, but the British still had to contend with a competitive ally as the Red Army invaded and occupied the north of the country. The two armies met face to face. But the Soviets were more concerned with events in the Caucasus, where local leaders were asserting their independence under the aegis of the occupying Germans. There were conquests, reconquests, and variations of spheres of influence. Mohammad Reza Shah succeeded his father. An Anglo-Soviet escort saw him to his palace. The British Army controlled both the refineries and the oil reserves of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Getting the oil out was vital to both the war effort and the British economy. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin acted as if he already owned the country. Even so, the Western leaders managed to secure Iran's independence, mainly to keep Soviets from staying. But Stalin won an immediate objective, a promise from President Roosevelt to open a second front on the French coast. Churchill had favored an offensive in the Balkans, which would block any Soviet move south. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, difficulties loomed between the West and the USSR, with its domination of the East. In Fulton, Missouri, Churchill predicted the Cold War.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The Jews who survived the horror of the Nazi camps hoped to find peace in Jerusalem. Would Europe agree to assuage its guilt? In the United States, Zionists had actively campaigned during the war for Jewish immigration to Palestine. In 1946, the Jewish Irgun group planted a bomb in the King David Hotel, the British headquarters in Jerusalem. 91 people were killed. The Mandate authorities tried to contain the terrorism, but they could not contain the flood of immigrants. The Arab League, founded in 1945, declared it was no less indifferent than anyone to the sufferings of the Jews in Europe. But it said their suffering was no excuse for the Christian and Muslim Arabs of Palestine to become victims as well. It demanded a united, independent Palestine. These images of the refugee ship Exodus in 1947 and the general sympathy in the West for the plight of the Jews dominated the debate. No one seemed to understand that the Jews' misfortune was now becoming the misfortune of the Arabs. In New York, the United Nations was considering the old plan for partitioning Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. Speaking for Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal defended the rights of the Arabs. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly voted for partition.
Ethiopia? Abstain? France? Yes? Soviet Union? Yes? United Kingdom? Abstain? The United States? Yes? Yemen? No?
Its mandate at an end, the British government announced it was pulling out. Fighting intensified. In Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. The Jewish immigrants had become Israelis. Ibn Saud and Farouk felt betrayed. The British-trained Arab Legion marches past King Abdullah of Transjordan. Separated from each other and ill-prepared for a conflict with the well-organized Israelis, the Arab armies went to war. The Israelis enjoyed a further advantage: shorter lines of communication. The Haganah and the Stern Gang massacred the villagers of Deir Yassin, a terrifying example for the Palestinians. The UN sent a mission headed by Count Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross to stop the fighting. He proposed an Israeli-Arab federal union encompassing all Palestine. Both sides rejected the idea. While the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood sent guerrillas to fight in the Sinai, Old Jerusalem was cruelly fought over. The Arab Legion finally captured all of its winding streets and crooked lanes. The Legion's British commander, Glab Pasha, was there. Bernadotte tried tirelessly to find a solution, insisting that the refugees be allowed to return to their homes. He was vilified by part of the Israeli press. On September 17, 1948, Bernadotte was assassinated in Jerusalem by men wearing Israeli uniform. Ironically, Arab resistance was weakening. In the new year, fighting progressively diminished. Armistices were signed at Rhodes between Israel and the different Arab states which had gone to war. King Abdullah integrated the Palestinian West Bank and East Jerusalem into Transjordan, renamed Jordan in 1950. The following year, a Palestinian assassinated him in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Any Jew now had the right to settle in the new state of Israel, but inevitably, it was a militarized society. An enclave in the Arab world, Israel was admitted to the United Nations. The Arab representatives walked out in protest. But Abba Eban had come to stay. Still, the Israeli government refused to let the Palestinian refugees return to their homes. Like the Jews before them, the camp generation had lost everything save its sense of identity. It would invest in education and resistance to survive. At the same time, Israel was organizing airlifts to bring in Jews from Iraq, Yemen, and the Maghreb. Meeting in London in 1950, the Western powers decided to limit arms sales to Israel and the Arabs to protect the existing borders. The Arabs felt isolated. the United States was acting on President Truman's doctrine of containing communism. Having rebuffed Stalin's advances since 1945, Turkey became part of NATO in 1952. Its new Prime Minister, Adnan Menderes, was on good terms with the West. His army was equipped with American weapons. But the cavalry was still reminiscent of the Ottoman Empire. Iran was a focus of Cold War maneuvering. Though bordering the Soviet Union, its Abadan refinery supplied Western Europe. In 1946, Iran's Prime Minister Gavan had met Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov in Moscow to negotiate the departure of Soviet troops. At the same time, he re-established his country's suzerainty over Azerbaijan and Iranian Kurdistan. One of the great landowners, Mohammad Mossadegh, now proposed the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The people were enthusiastic. He became Prime Minister in 1951 and acted on his proposal. With the help of the Shiite mullahs, who opposed foreign economic interference, Mossadegh won wide support from the Muslim faithful. Britain retaliated with a boycott of Iranian oil. The British fleet in the Persian Gulf made sure it was observed. Mossadegh traveled to New York to plead his case before the United Nations and to obtain an American loan. In vain, the Eisenhower administration was concerned about the Tudeh, the Iranian Communist Party, which, after having attacked Mossadegh, had now decided to support him against the United States. In August 1953, General Zahedi deposed Mossadegh with CIA assistance. The anti-Shah demonstrations were put down by the army. Mossadegh was arrested, then put on trial. Although ill, he vigorously defended his policies. As a result, he became a symbol of independence and opposition to foreign interference in the Middle East. In Egypt, Farouk was thinking along similar lines. In 1951, the Egyptian government abrogated the 1936 treaty that gave Britain control of the Canal Zone. There were demonstrations in Cairo. As a result, 75,000 British troops were sent to guard the waterway. The Muslim Brotherhood sent guerrillas to harass the soldiers. They, in turn, hunted down suspects and took repressive measures, only increasing the population's hostility. Barbed wire was not enough to halt the process of decolonization. European families were sent home. In January 1952, the British raided the Bulak Nizam police barracks in Ismailia and rounded up guerrilla suspects. An outbreak of arson followed in Cairo. An underground movement known as the Free Officers now began to organize in the Egyptian army. Apart from opposing the British presence in Egypt, they believed the world had betrayed them with the creation of Israel. Muslim sheikhs and Copt priests joined the movement. In July 1952, The Egyptian army toppled the government. The revolutionaries were led by General Neguib, who was very popular with the crowds. But the real leader was Abdel Gamal Nasser. Farouk abdicated and went into exile. In Iraq, oil revenues had allowed the Hashemite monarchy to expand public works. In May 1953, Faisal II was crowned in Baghdad, but the Iraqi opposition denounced the government as corrupt and repressive. On the same day, Faisal's cousin Hussein was crowned king of Jordan. He was only 17. The West was now confronted with increasing nationalist movements and anti-imperialist attitudes all over the Arab world. The US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was able to make his presence felt. But did the old British lion still have enough teeth to hold the Suez Canal? In spite of the political turmoil, Cairo was undergoing a population explosion and an economic boom. The people were in a mood for change. Like most of the population, Nasser came from a rural background. As head of state, he began agricultural reforms that redistributed land to the peasants while weakening the social dominance of the great landowners. Tradition was challenged in other ways too. Nasser suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood, while women went on hunger strike to demand equal rights. In July 1954, the United States pressured Britain into signing an agreement under which British troops would leave the Suez Canal within 20 months. The Egyptians were ecstatic. The British had occupied the zone since 1882. Now they were going home. In spite of his one-party rule and assaults on tradition, Nasser was becoming the hope of the Arab world. His radio station, Voice of the Arabs, was followed from the Gulf to the Atlantic. There was fresh fighting near Gaza, reminding the world of Arab-Israeli tension and the fate of the Palestinians. To avoid new humiliations, Egypt needed modern arms. Where would she find them? Nasser refused to join the British-sponsored Baghdad Pact of Middle Eastern nations, but in April 1955, he attended the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung. There, President Sukarno gave him a starring role. Nehru, at the height of his fame, advised non-alignment. As for weapons, Zhou Enlai advised Nasser to seek Soviet help. The deal was done. The USSR increased its influence in both Cairo and the Middle East. From June 1956, the Soviets supplied the Egyptian army with Czech-made weapons. Nasser also planned to build a dam at Aswan to irrigate, electrify, and modernize the nation. The West refused to grant him a loan, so he decided the canal would pay for the dam. On July 26, 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. For Egyptians, the nationalization restored their nation's honor. In London, the British and French proposed that the canal be declared international. Nasser rejected this attempt at international colonialism. On October 29th, Israel attacked. For the Israelis, the nationalization and Egypt's rearmament were too much. 2 days later, the British and the French launched their own attacks, supposedly to stop the Israeli-Egyptian conflict. But their real aims were different. Britain simply wanted the canal back. France, fighting a colonial war in Algeria, wanted to punish Nasser for assisting the Algerian rebels. The Anglo-French explanations to the Security Council were not impressive. Their first attacks came from carriers and air bases in Cyprus and Malta. The Israelis seized the Gaza Strip, further humbling an already humiliated people. Moshe Dayan was in the Sinai. He accepts an Egyptian general's surrender. Israeli soldiers proudly displayed captured Soviet material. On November 5th, British and French paratroops were dropped on Port Said, where the canal meets the Mediterranean. A seaborne invasion followed. While Soviet tanks were finishing off the last of the Hungarian rebels in Budapest, the British and French armies were fighting for Port Said. The Egyptians replied by scuttling ships to block the canal entrance. Ferdinand de Lesseps' statue was blown up. The last drop of French paratroops exasperated the United States and fed Soviet propaganda in the Middle East. By November 2nd, the United States had convinced the UN General Assembly to demand an Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai and a cessation of hostilities. Golda Meir agreed. The British and French had no choice but to agree as well. A UN peacekeeping force arrived to separate Egypt and Israel in the Sinai. The UN troops were acclaimed like liberators. For Egypt, military defeat had become a political victory. The Israelis evacuated. The British and the French soon followed. Their failed gamble would hasten the decline of the colonial empires. Nasser had become the hero of Arab nationalism. And from Port Said and Alexandria, the Europeans were going home. General Qassem was executed in February 1963 after a Ba'athist coup in Baghdad. The new president was Abd el-Salam Aref, but he leaned towards Nasser and soon purged the Ba'athist elements from his regime. In spite of this, the Ba'ath party came to power that March in neighboring Syria. Salah Bitar, the Syrian prime minister, prudently re-entered Nasser's fold. After disturbances and political unrest in June 1963, the Shah of Iran expelled the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he majestically received General de Gaulle in October. With his oil wealth and American support, the Shah wanted Iran to become a strategic focal point from its frontiers on the borders of the Soviet Union and Iraq to the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Khrushchev countered this by cultivating Egypt. Nasser spoke of Soviet imperialism and had the communists arrested, but released them in 1963. In May 1964, he greeted Khrushchev in Alexandria before traveling to the Aswan to open the first stage of the Great Dam. His Soviet guest declared that Egypt was busily building socialism. Khrushchev's last official trip was a resounding success. The waters of the Nile were rerouted. Whole Nubian populations had been displaced, and the ecological effects were unknown. But Egypt was counting on an increase in irrigation and an abundant supply of electricity, and Nasser needed a success to deal with the resurgent Muslim Brotherhood. Would Israel ever know true peace? Many Israelis hoped for détente with the Arabs, but the most extreme Zionists still had not accomplished their goals for a greater Israel. On their doorstep, in Gaza as elsewhere, the interlude gave the Palestinians time to think as well. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded. Leaders like Yasser Arafat were sustained by the common revolt against misery. In addition to the conflicting solutions sponsored by the United States and Soviet Union, General de Gaulle offered his own contribution.
La Ve République s'était dégagée vis-à-vis d'Israël des liens spéciaux et très étroits que le régime précédent avait noués avec cet État. Et la Ve République s'était appliquée, au contraire, à favoriser la détente dans le Moyen-Orient. D'autre part, une fois mis un terme à l'affaire algérienne, nous avions repris, avec les peuples arabes d'Orient, la même politique d'amitié, de coopération qui avait été, pendant des siècles, celle de la France dans cette partie du monde. Bien entendu, nous ne laissions pas ignorer aux Arabes que pour nous, l'État d'Israël était un fait accompli et que nous n'admettrions pas qu'il fût détruit.
Nasser made a show of his Soviet weaponry to hide his economic and political difficulties, but constant Arab bickering, Palestinian terrorism, and Israeli raids against Syria exasperated everyone. In May 1967, a parade in Israel commemorated the creation of the state. Nasser asked for the UN troops on the Egyptian side of the border with Israel to be withdrawn. General Secretary U Thant agreed. Israel mobilized. Nasser blockaded the Israeli port of Eilat. King Hussein of Jordan signed a defense pact with Egypt.
Pour éviter les hostilités, la France avait, dès le 24 mai, proposé aux trois autres grandes puissances d'interdire, conjointement avec elle, à chacune des deux parties d'entamer le combat. Le 2 juin, le gouvernement français avait officiellement déclaré qu'éventuellement il donnerait tort à quiconque entamerait le premier l'action des armes.
Israel attacked on June 5, 1967. Moshe Dayan was the new Minister of Defense. Israeli pilots, highly trained, used the element of surprise to annihilate Egyptian aircraft on the ground, then Jordan's, then Syria's. The Arabs lost 418 aircraft, the Israelis only 26. Badly informed by his intelligence services, disconcerted by both his army's deficiencies and his enemy's plan of attack, Nasser was appalled by Israel's popularity in the West. The Israeli Air Force flew continuous missions, opening the path for the tanks. Egyptian and Arab communications were in disarray. The Israelis rushed to Gaza and pushed on towards the Suez Canal, which they reached after an intensive tank battle. The canal itself would be closed to navigation until 1975. On the Eastern Front, the Jordanians suffered heavy losses. The Israelis broke through and took the old city of Jerusalem. The streets of the city, whose name is a symbol of peace, ran red with blood once again. Moshe Dayan led his soldiers to the Wailing Wall. The whole of the Sinai Peninsula, with its oil fields, was occupied. In the north, the Israelis stormed the Golan Heights and expelled all the inhabitants except the Druze. The Six-Day War ended on June 10th. Israel was triumphant from Mount Harmon to the Sinai, from the Suez Canal to the Jordan River, and the Arab armies were destroyed. Israeli flags dominated the ramparts of the old city of Jerusalem, which was annexed on June 28th. The old Jewish quarter would be restored to house Israelis. And as in other occupied territories, there were expropriations. Near the Wailing Wall, houses were torn down and their owners scared away to increase the esplanade leading to the wall. During a press conference on November 27th, de Gaulle declared,
Israël ayant attaqué, s'est emparé en 6 jours de combat des objectifs qu'il voulait atteindre. Maintenant, il organise sur les territoires qu'il a pris l'occupation qui ne peut aller sans oppression, répression, expulsion. Et il s'y manifeste contre lui la résistance, qu'à son tour, il qualifie de terrorisme.
Arab hopes were kept alive by boycotts and a resumption of guerrilla warfare in August 1967. The Israeli government declared that it would deal only on a state-to-state level, thus excluding the Palestinians who had no state. But the Palestinians were now more than ever the heart of the problem. The war and the occupation sent a new wave of refugees fleeing to Jordan. The UN counted 350,000 new refugees in the Jordanian camps. The very isolation of these people strengthened their identity. The occupied territory on the west bank of the Jordan, called Judea and Samaria by the Israelis, remained Jordanian under international law. The already numerous Palestinians had a high birth rate. They kept up close family and financial contacts with those who had fled. Crushed by defeat, Nasser appeared on television on June 9th. In a choking voice, the great orator announced his resignation. He was still speaking when a cry went up from thousands. Gamal, Gamal, don't leave us. We need you. He stayed on as head of state, but Marshal Amer was arrested, as well as the heads of the secret police. Amer committed suicide. There were pro-Nasser demonstrations in Algeria as well. Strengthened by his popular support, Nasser attended the Arab summit in Khartoum. the Arab heads of state refused to negotiate with Israel from their position of weakness. To save Egypt from economic ruin, Nasser accepted aid from his former rival, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Conservative and shrewd, Faisal had steadily built up his country with oil revenues. In November, the UN voted for Resolution 242, which called on Israel to evacuate occupied territory and for mutual respect between states within secure boundaries. The Palestinians were training hard. If their leaders had learnt one thing from the war, it was that they could rely only upon themselves. The camps became paramilitary training bases. The PLO was made up of several factions. In both Jordan and Lebanon, it established administrations as if it were a state within a state. In March 1968, after a terrorist attack, Israel struck back at the camp of Karama in Jordan. The Fedayeen were hit hard, but managed to hold off the Israelis with the help of Jordanian army artillery. Arab morale was buoyed up by this feat of arms. In December 1968, after an El Al plane was hijacked, an Israeli commando unit jumped out of a helicopter and destroyed 13 planes at Beirut's international airport. They used French weapons. De Gaulle immediately imposed an arms embargo on Israel and said that France had always been Lebanon's friend. After using every possible delaying tactic, Nasser finally accepted an American plan for the evacuation of the Sinai. But the Israeli government also stalled. Meanwhile, a lone arsonist set fire to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which stands on the site of the old Jewish temple of Jerusalem. The fire enraged the Muslim Palestinians, thus ensuring further repression. Their plight troubled all the Islamic nations. Hassan II of Morocco organized the first Islamic conference in Rabat in September 1969. Its permanent seat was later set up in Saudi Arabia. Times of trial were coming in Jordan. King Hussein had secretly been in touch with various Israeli ministers. He now accepted an American plan for reconstruction in the demilitarized zones. The plan was strongly opposed by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by George Habash. In September 1970, this organization hijacked several aircraft. Neither Nasser nor Arafat could prevent the inevitable result. The Jordanian army attacked the Palestinians and expelled them from the country, despite an apparent compromise signed in Cairo on September 27th. Exhausted by this last setback, Nasser succumbed to a stroke the following day. He was only 51. His funeral ceremony was as impressive as he was. Israeli raids several months before had restored all his former popularity. His failures and mistakes typified the difficulties of a nation having to modernize in record time. Egypt had a population of 19 million in 1947, 31 million in 1966, and 56 million in 1991, all concentrated in the Nile Valley. Nasser left his people with a memory of national pride recovered and an unaccomplished dream of Arab unity. Nasser also left behind Hafez al-Assad, who had taken control of Syria. And the new president of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, who had links with the Muslim Brotherhood. Both men would be rivals to fill Nasser's shoes as leaders of the Arab world. In this sequence, they're seen praying with a third rival, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who is nearest the camera. After becoming head of the PLO in 1969, Yasser Arafat spent much of his time trying to unite its various factions. The hardliners remained devoted to terror tactics, such as the murder of Israeli athletes in the Munich Olympic Games. The crime turned much of world opinion against the Palestinians, especially as Germany already held so many painful memories for the Jews. The Israelis hunted down the murderers. They destroyed a Libyan civilian flight because one of the terrorists was aboard. Opinion turned against the Israelis once again. In order to halt the endless seesaw of half war, half peace, President Sadat purged his regime of radical Nasserites and sent home the Soviet military advisors. The Egyptian army now felt capable of self-reliance. To maintain their influence in the Middle East, the Soviets strengthened their ties with Syria and Iraq, where the Ba'ath Party had returned to power in 1968. After so many victories, the Israelis had become accustomed to supremacy. With close ties to the United States, they had ready access to the most advanced weapons, and the US 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean gave them a further guarantee. But on October 6, 1973, as the Jews were keeping Kippur and the Muslims observed Ramadan, the Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal. Sadat believed that the invasion would break the deadlock and allow him to negotiate in the name of all Arabs. And, as the French Foreign Minister Michel Joubert asked, is it really an act of aggression to regain your own land? The Israelis retreated, losing many tanks and their best pilots. The battle spread to the Golan, where the Syrians were joined by the Iraqis, the Jordanians, and the Moroccans. The Israelis managed to contain the assault, but they were short of supplies. To prevent a resort to nuclear weapons, the United States began an airlift of conventional arms to Israel. Simultaneously, the Soviets kept the Egyptians from using their long-range missiles and put pressure on Iran not to attack Iraq while its army was in Syria. Proud of their partial victory, the Arabs realized the influence they could have internationally if only they could unite. Meeting in Kuwait, the oil-producing states decided to limit their sales and increase their prices. For the first time, oil was used as a weapon, and at least in the short term, it was far more effective than any display of force. Meanwhile, General Sharon led an Israeli force across the Suez Canal to cut off the Egyptians in Sinai. When the Security Council reaffirmed Resolution 242, Sadat accepted a ceasefire and received the US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger.
We agreed that disengagement of forces, separation of forces, should be the principal subject of the first phase of the peace conference.
Faced with the American-Soviet monopoly in the Middle East, France convinced the EC to begin talks with Arab League representatives at the 1973 summit in Copenhagen. Oil sales and Middle East security were high on the agenda. Kissinger was in favor of a step-by-step policy with each state, rather than a global approach. Israel refused to evacuate the West Bank, but did quit the Canal Zone and the small city of Kneitra in Syria. Hafez el-Assad in person supervised the citizens' return to Kneitra, so strengthening his position in the Arab world vis-à-vis Sadat. Israel continued its policy of reprisals against the Palestinian guerrilla bases in Lebanon. More often than not, the civilians were the hardest hit. In November 1974, the UN General Assembly pleased the Arab League by receiving Yasser Arafat. After his speech, it agreed that the Palestinian people should have the right to both self-determination and independence. But while asking for peaceful coexistence, Arafat still endorsed his organization's revolutionary terror tactics. In Lebanon, there were skirmishes between the Lebanese army and the Palestinian guerrillas. Lebanese public opinion was divided on the issue. President Fanjeh asked for Syrian help. But the Druze aristocrat, Kamal Jumblat, began a national movement to regroup both the left and the various Muslim groups. A tragedy occurred in April 1975 when Christian phalangists machine-gunned a Palestinian bus. The Palestinians now had a real organized army. For the time being, they alone were capable of facing the Christian phalangists. The phalangists had recruited elements from the new middle class, who were frustrated by the traditional ruling class. They also backed the Lebanese Front, a mainly Christian militia that opposed political concessions to the growing majority of Muslims in Lebanon. The sheer cruelty of this civil war became obvious as the battle for the center of Beirut got underway. The Sunni Muslim Rashid Karameh could not form a stable cabinet. Christian Maronite leader Raymond Ede described the government's downfall.
Il n'y a plus d'État, il n'y a plus de justice. Le siège du gouvernement a pris feu, l'État civil, les services fonciers, tout, il n'y a plus d'armée, il n'y a plus de gendarmerie, il n'y a plus de boueux pour ramasser les ordures.
Lebanon became a patchwork of no-go areas, controlled by feuding militias. In May and June 1976, Syria sent troops against the Palestinians and the leftists. Supported by Israel, the Lebanese Front militiamen attacked the Palestinian camp of Tel Zatar. It fell after a 3-month siege. Arab unification was only a memory. On November 19, 1977, President Sadat landed in Jerusalem. It was a coup for American diplomacy. Sadat believed that only the United States, Israel's principal ally, could broker an Arab-Israeli peace. He needed peace to improve his economy and to remain the main leader of the Arabs, on whose behalf, he said, he was addressing the Knesset.
Bismillah, Sayyid Rais al-Knesset,
Shalom le'ameinu, shelo yada shalom afilu yom echad.
But while he spoke for the rights of the Palestinians, Menachem Begin defended those of the Zionists. The Camp David Agreement, concluded in September 1978, did not solve these differences, even though it provided for autonomy for the Palestinians of the occupied territories. As Israel wanted, the negotiations were state to state, focusing mainly on Egyptian-Israeli differences. The main result was the return of the Sinai to Egypt. The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty was signed in Washington in March 1979. The other Arab states were humiliated. Without Egypt, there could be no such thing as a unified Arab strategy. Ambitions became localized. Alliances were broken. Syria became the ally of the Palestinian movements, even the most extreme. Beirut was continually bombarded. Egypt was suspended from the League of Arab States, whose seat was transferred from Cairo to Tunis. In Iran, crowds were screaming, "God is great." The sudden increase in OPEC oil prices had enriched a minority, but also caused inflation that further impoverished the poor. In September 1978, from his exile in Iraq, the Ayatollah Khomeini called for a rising against the Shah. Thousands died in the subsequent street battles.
Ce genre de gouvernement dictatorial a engendré, bien sûr, une corruption rarement égalée.
Chapur Bakhtiar, a liberal of the opposition, agreed to form a new cabinet. Too late. The Shah was forced to flee in January 1979. Khomeini spent several weeks in France after the Iranian government insisted that he leave Iraq. But he was anxiously expected in Tehran. He arrived on February the 1st. His message was simple. Iran needed a thoroughly Islamic state and a complete break with both capitalism and communism. The result was the Islamic Revolution, which reached far beyond the borders of Iran. In November, Islamic students seized the United States Embassy and took its diplomats hostage. President Carter eventually ordered a helicopter rescue mission, which failed. The American hostages were held until January 1981, after President Reagan's election. In December 1979, on the invitation of the Afghan Communist Party, which had seized power a year earlier, the Soviet Union massively invaded Afghanistan. The king of Afghanistan had been overthrown in 1973. The new regime tried to silence the powerful but divided Islamic movements. It asked for Soviet aid, especially to modernize the cities. The communists redistributed the land in an attempt to weaken the tribal chiefs, but their reforms went against the grain of the peasants' traditions and family links. There was revolt in almost two-thirds of the country. To defeat the opposition and to support Babrak Kemal's government, the USSR went to war in Afghanistan, south of its republics in Central Asia. Facing Soviet tanks and aircraft, the insurgents held the mountains and organized bases in Pakistan. They were united by Islam, but divided by tribal feuding. After the American failure in Iran and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the European community used the June 1980 summit in Venice to present a plan to resolve conflicts in the Middle East. In 1975, Saddam Hussein had visited France as the Iraqi vice president. Despite an alliance with the Soviet Union, Iraq wanted to step up its modernization, particularly in the nuclear sector, and increase trade with the West. In 1979, Saddam Hussein overthrew Hassan al-Bakr and replaced him as president. A full-scale purge of the Ba'ath Party leadership followed. At the same time, Iraq's relations with Khomeini's Iran were deteriorating. The revolutionary Shiite government in Tehran was fomenting dissent in southern Iraq, where the majority of people were Shiite Muslims, the dominant faith in Iran. There were numerous incidents along the border. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein took advantage of Iran's turmoil to launch a surprise attack. Although the population of Iraq was only 1/3 of the population of Iran, Saddam counted on his neighbors' disorganization and his own military superiority. The Iranians were pushed back. But Khomeini fired his countrymen to wage a holy war against Saddam's secular regime. Encouraged by events in Iran, Islamic fundamentalists campaigned all over the Middle East, especially in Egypt, where their aspirations became more and more radical. Many were arrested. On October 6, 1981, President Sadat was assassinated by a group of officers who all came from the poorest neighborhoods surrounding Cairo. All were Islamic fundamentalists. The new president, Hosni Mubarak, tried to stabilize Egypt internally and restore its international image. In June 1982, the Israeli army invaded Lebanon. The operation, codenamed Peace for Galilee, culminated in a siege of Beirut, which the Israelis shelled and bombed for 3 months in an attempt to dislodge the PLO. The Palestinians and their Lebanese allies resisted fiercely. After a series of international talks, Arafat and his guerrillas finally left Beirut, with American, French, and Italian troops supervising the ceasefire. The young leader of the Lebanese front, Bashir Gemayel, was elected president of Lebanon on August 23rd. His followers barely had time to celebrate his victory. He was assassinated on September 14th. Two days later, Christian militiamen broke into the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila, which were surrounded by Israeli troops, and massacred 4,000 people. Arafat took refuge in Tripoli in northern Lebanon, but after a year the Syrians forced him out of Lebanon altogether. He was evacuated by a French warship. Meanwhile, the war between Iraq and Iran had become a ceaseless butchery in the trenches. After its first success, Iraq had to back off. Saddam resorted to chemical warfare to hold the human wave assaults of the Iranians. By 1986, the Hezbollah, or Party of God, was firmly established in the Lebanese cities of Beirut and Baalbek. Spreading Khomeini's gospel of martyrdom, they became notorious for their bloody remembrance of the death in battle of Imam Hussein, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. The Iranian Revolution had reached the Mediterranean. Many Arab regimes, especially Sunni ones, were apprehensive at spectacles like this. From 1984, over 60 Westerners were kidnapped in Lebanon. Most were released in the end, but many Lebanese hostages were murdered. In Paris, in Scotland and elsewhere, terrorism killed indiscriminately, breaking hearts and souls. The terrorists were often arrested, but the planners remained free. By the end of Amin Gemayel's presidency in 1988, the Christian faction in Beirut was torn by internal strife for the top position. In this, they were no different from the rest of Lebanon. The Intifada insurrection began late in 1987. Most Palestinian youths in the occupied territories seemed to support it. The daily incidents caused many casualties, but the Palestinians showed their resistance to Israeli settlement. Muslim fundamentalism also gained a foothold. The EC proposed an international conference for peace in the Middle East. The League of Arab States accepted, but Israel rejected negotiations with the PLO. In July 1987, even Mecca became a target for Iranian militants who rioted against Saudi wealth in the name of the Ayatollah. Western naval fleets patrolled the Gulf to protect the oil fields of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. In 1988, Iraq launched a new offensive to recover lost ground. It also increased its missile range to hit Tehran. An exhausted Iran once again faced invasion. After UN intervention, it accepted a ceasefire. Saddam Hussein celebrated his victory, but the Iranian Revolution was not defeated. The Middle East landscape was transformed again with the evacuation of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan and the progressive decline of Soviet influence in the region. In November 1988, Yasser Arafat addressed the Palestinian National Council in Algiers.
Bismillah. وباسم الشعب وباسم الشعب العربي الفلسطيني قيام دولة فلسطين فوق أرضنا الفلسطينية.
Arafat claimed both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for this state of Palestine. The proposed state was purely hypothetical, but it enabled him to address the UN in Geneva and to be received by President Mitterrand. He now called for peaceful coexistence between Israel and Palestine as neighboring states. At the end of its term, the Reagan administration accepted the idea of negotiating with the PLO. In Israel, Shimon Peres was not opposed to negotiations, but Yitzhak Shamir rejected the very idea. Khomeini died on June 3, 1989. The Iranian authorities were torn between the need to maintain the Ayatollah's legacy, which still had massive popular support, and the economic necessity of re-establishing commercial ties with the West. In Lebanon, the MPs were finally electing a new president. René Marwad was elected on November 5, 1989. He was immediately supported by the Maronite Patriarch. But General Aoun refused to recognize him and forbade him to enter the presidential palace. Marwad was assassinated on November 22nd. On July 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. All Iraqi governments since the 30s had claimed suzerainty over Kuwait, and so had Saddam, but his threats were often dismissed as bluffing. Now he needed access to the sea and a fresh source of oil revenue in order to restore his economy after the disastrous war with Iran. Kuwait's Sheikh Jaber al-Sabah, counting on American support, had refused Saddam's demands. President Bush announced that he would send troops and asked for an embargo on trade with Iraq. The League of Arab States conferred in Cairo. The majority condemned Iraq. On September 24th, President Mitterrand addressed the United Nations. The United States concentrated a third of its military might in the Gulf. American soldiers were brought in from all over the world, including many bases in Western Europe. The coalition of forces opposing Iraq included many Arab nations as well as France and Britain. Saddam tried taking Westerners hostage, even children. He called them his guests. He finally released them all, but he did not evacuate Kuwait.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart? And with cornflakes too?
He was counting on the popular support that was obvious in many Arab countries, especially in Jordan. King Hussein and Yasser Arafat were his staunchest supporters. Hafez el-Assad joined the battle, sending some Syrian troops to join the coalition in Saudi Arabia and others to crack down in Lebanon. General Aoun attempted a last stand in the presidential palace, but was overwhelmed by President Helias Houhi and the Syrian forces. His followers surrendered. Aoun himself found political asylum in the French embassy. The martyred, exhausted city could finally begin to reunite. The Lebanese army now being reformed and the Syrian army began to disarm the different militias. The militiamen themselves exported some of their weapons. Once again, there were peaceful exchanges between the different neighborhoods of Beirut. Relatives and friends were able to communicate freely. But the war in the Gulf increased tensions in the occupied territories. Palestinian and Israeli strife worsened. The Intifada gained a violent momentum. There were casualties almost every day. The fundamentalists celebrated their martyrs.
Please raise their hand.
On November 29, 1990, the UN Security Council authorized the nations of the coalition to use all means to re-establish the sovereignty of Kuwait.
Resolution 678, 1990.
The ultimatum expired on January 15, 1990. January 17th, 0 hour, the air attack began. The objectives were Iraq's military bases and industrial centers. The Iraqis retaliated, firing Scud missiles on Saudi Arabia and Israel. Most were intercepted by American Patriot missiles. The newest Iraqi factories and communications facilities were destroyed. The civilian population also suffered. After a new ultimatum, President Bush ordered a land offensive. It began on February 24th. Thus founded the Iraqi army, which was a threat to Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and perhaps to Saddam Hussein himself, if he had not fully occupied it elsewhere. A ruined Kuwait was finally liberated. A ceasefire was reached after only 4 days, but the Iraqis set the oil wells aflame before retreating. Congress gave George Bush a standing ovation, but Saddam Hussein remained in power. His Republican Guard crushed all opposition. In the north, the Kurds revolted, hoping more for support than mere goodwill. The Arab Shiites also revolted in the south, supported by Iran. There was and is merciless repression. The Middle East is beset by the menacing low thunder of discontented peoples.